it's 4 o'clock, and I think we should begin. I see that someone has mentioned that some school staff are finishing meetings right now, and so we do hope that they will be able to join us shortly. But I would like to welcome all of you to today's webinar, and we are just truly fortunate to have Dr. Jim Cummins with us today to deliver some very important information for our EAL teacher specialists and many others in Saskatchewan school divisions who work with EAL learners. And so I'm going to switch my screen. And I'd like to begin by recognizing that we are broadcasting from the University of Saskatchewan, and our university is situated on Treaty 6 territory, the homeland of the Korean Métis Nation, and the Dene, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota. We recognize the First Nations and Métis people who have called this ancestral land home for generations and whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our community. On a foundation of reconciliation, recognition, and respect, we are committed to reaffirming relationships with one another and to establishing new ones. So we welcome all those joining this session from other treaty territories and locations. And I would like to add here that we are all truly saddened by the discovery of 215 young lives lost all too soon at the Kamloops Residential School. Tomorrow, the University of Saskatchewan is observing 215 seconds of silence at 2:15 p.m. in honor of these children. We invite you to collectively grieve with us at this time as you are able, wherever you are in the province. So on the screen, you see the format of today's webinar, and we'll begin with a few words of welcome from the president of Sask-TEAL, Giselle Carlson. And so I'm going to ask Giselle to turn on her video screen, and we'll get the audio going so that she can deliver some words of welcome. Giselle, go ahead.
Thank you. Greetings from Saskatchewan Teachers of EAL. Sask-TEAL is an organization dedicated to the teaching of English as an additional language in the province of Saskatchewan. One of the professional growth networks supported by the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation, its aim is to provide professional development opportunities and promote appropriate training for educators working with EAL learners at the pre-kindergarten to grade 12 levels, as well as those interested in EAL in the community, and to support the creation of materials and curricula that will effectively support EAL learners. We also work with outside organizations who wish to help build the world of K-12 EAL education within Saskatchewan, such as the University of Saskatchewan, who we are excited to partner with today in sponsoring the webinar. Thank you for taking time out of your busy lives to take part in this webinar and learn more about supporting our EAL students.
Thank you very much, Giselle. And the University of Saskatchewan and our College of Education is truly fortunate to be able to partner with Sask-TEAL on this professional learning initiative. And this is the second time that we've had this partnership, and it works very well for the delivery of professional learning in the area of EAL education. And so on behalf of the College of Education, I would like to welcome everyone into the room. My name is Nadia Prokopchuk, and I am the academic advisor, and my responsibilities are with EAL education and the EAL certificate program in our college. So I'm very pleased to be able to see so many people in this virtual space that we have today, and to see that there is a high degree of interest in the topic and in our presenter today. So welcome once again. And so today is a very special day for us in Saskatchewan. For the next 90 minutes, we will be sharing a virtual web space with Dr. Jim Cummins, Professor Emeritus at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, University of Toronto. And once again, I'm going to just remind everyone to please keep your audio muted and place your questions into the chat pod. I'm putting Dr. Cummins' opening screen up on in the space for all of you to see, and I'll continue with this introduction. So for those of you who are not familiar with Dr. Cummins' background, he was born and raised in Ireland, getting his bachelor's degree and diploma in applied psychology at the National University of Ireland. Lucky for us in Canada, he decided to pursue his doctoral studies in educational psychology at the University of Alberta. After receiving his PhD, he became a visiting professor in modern languages at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. Shortly thereafter, he became a tenured professor in the Department of Curriculum, Teaching, and Learning. His academic CV is long and impressive. He has authored 18 books, edited 11 books, written 165 book chapters, and 114 journal articles. And I could go on with this list of academic accomplishments. As Professor Emeritus since 2014, Dr. Cummins holds a prestigious Canada Research Chair, Tier 1, and has been the recipient of numerous awards, including an honorary doctorate in humane letters from the Bank Street College of Education in New York City. Dr. Cummins continues to hold a number of editorial positions with various academic journals. He is called upon often as a conference guest speaker and lecturer. And this is globally, nationally, internationally, globally. Dr. Cummins has originated groundbreaking research and theories such as the Common Underlying Proficiency, or CUP theory, the distinction between conversational and academic language, described by the acronyms BICS and CALP, and the language support model known as Cummins quadrants. And P.S., if you Google images for any of these terms, you will immediately see that his work is quoted, shared, and presented by countless individuals making presentations about language education. Dr. Cummins' latest book, which is coming out in August, is titled Rethinking the Education of Multilingual Learners. And it's a culmination of his 40-year journey of research and dedication to the field of bi and multilingual education. Language specialist Colin Baker, who reviewed his book, has described it as follows. The volume provides an up-to-date analysis of translanguaging, considering its strengths, its criticisms, and offers practical translanguaging ideas for classrooms and curriculum activities. This book is Jim Cummins' finest contribution to the literature. I've had the privilege of speaking with Dr. Cummins at several conferences, and in each conversation, he has been down to earth, personable, a good listener, and humble scholar. I know that he has been an extraordinary coach and mentor to students, faculty, and language colleagues across borders and cultures. I believe that Dr. Cummins is one of the few Canadian scholars who truly understands the linguistic and cultural demographics of Western Canada. His writing resonates with the knowledge that Canada is multilingual and the languages of all people are important. Our college's certificate program in EAL education has certainly benefited from his writing and research. So on this hottest day in Saskatchewan to date this year, we welcome, and I hope Dr. Cummins hears our virtual applause, we welcome Canada's most distinguished language specialist, Dr. Jim Cummins.
Okay, thank you, Nadia, for that really warm introduction. And it's wonderful to feel like I'm back in Western Canada again, even though it's virtually. I could do without the 35 degrees, but I'm sure people are enjoying it. When I was in Edmonton, I did my PhD at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. I like to say sometimes that I spent 5 frozen years of my life in Edmonton. But what I remember is our winters with blue skies, -20, -25, but a sun shining that would just warm you up psychologically, even though it was colder than I'd ever experienced before. So it's really nice to be back in the neighborhood of Western Canada, and I'm delighted to be here. And thank you, Nadia, and your colleagues for the invitation to participate in this webinar. I'm going to move to my PowerPoint at this point. What you see on the initial slide there is a photograph from a grade 4 classroom in the Toronto area. This was part of a project that my colleague and friend from University of British Columbia, Margaret Early, and I had for over about 4 or 5 years, from about 2002 to 2006. And we worked very closely with teachers and schools in the Toronto region and in the Vancouver region to look at or to talk with them about how they could broaden the space in their classrooms to bring in the languages of their students. And we worked in highly multilingual, multicultural schools and classrooms, but also not just to broaden it to bring in the languages, but to bring in other modalities. The term that was being used at the time, and is still a very common term, is the term multiliteracies. And that term came from the argument that in teaching literacy, we've got to broaden our focus beyond just kind of narrow print literacy, reading and writing skills, because we're entering a world in which there's all kinds of modalities in which literacies are being displayed. And obviously, if that was true in 2002, it's much more obvious right now. So the project was called the Multiliteracies Project. But the photograph you're seeing is from one classroom where the teacher had opened up discussion about the languages that are in their school. She shared her knowledge of additional languages. She had been born in India. She spoke about 6 different languages. And by her sharing her knowledge of other languages and her experience with language, her attitude towards languages, which ones were in a way closer to her heart, which ones she used for different kinds of things, that opened up the space or gave students the trust, if you like, to talk about the languages that they knew. And this was the first time that many students had been able to do that, or felt that it was okay to share their knowledge of other languages in the school and in the classroom. And so you see the heading, all our languages in our school, and underneath that you've got writing by different students of their experience in learning different languages, who they use them with, etc. And so that's a kind of a theme that'll run through what I'm going to try and talk about. So let me give you the kind of an overview of where I hope to go in the presentation. So the major points that I want to make is that if we're looking at closing achievement gaps between EAL and non-EAL students, all school administrators and educators should be familiar with the following instructional strategies that are all supported by a large amount of research evidence. First of all, we need to be prepared to scaffold comprehension and production of language. I know with teachers from EAL backgrounds or French immersion backgrounds, I don't need to explain what the notion of scaffolding is. But this is something that in a lot of contexts, the mindset has traditionally been that in providing provision for EAL students, that's the job of the EAL teacher. And the mindset has been that other teachers, so-called mainstream teachers or at the secondary level content teachers, don't really need to know anything about this. The EAL teacher will take care of, quotes, the problem. And then when students have learned enough English, then they can participate in the rest of the curriculum. I'm going to suggest that there are some major issues in that mindset. A second instruction strategy that we need to talk about within our schools is how can we reinforce academic language across the curriculum? I'll talk about the distinction that Nadia mentioned in her introduction between academic language and conversational fluency in the language. And I think that's a critical thing to be aware of. Again, not just on the part of EAL teachers, but all teachers and all administrators. A third point that I'll try and highlight is the fact that students' first languages are not the enemy. They're not an impediment to the learning of English. They're part of students' lives. They're part of who they are. They're part of their communication outside of school. And they're also potentially really important in the long term for what they do with their lives and who they can communicate with in their lives. So I'm going to share a number of examples of how teachers have expanded the linguistic space within their classrooms to welcome in students' languages and what that has enabled students to do. A fourth strategy concerns literacy. And if we're talking about academic language, we've got to ask, well, where do we find academic language? We find it in two places. We find it in classrooms and we find it in printed text. And sometimes the mindset within a school has been that, okay, we've got X number or X proportion of EAL students. We've got EAL teachers who will help those students learn the language of instruction. And the focus has been on supporting students in learning English. I'm going to suggest that we need to broaden that focus considerably, because a lot of the students that we're talking about when we talk about EAL students are also students who are coming from low-income backgrounds. They may be recent immigrants. Their parents may have immigrated recently. They may be struggling to get a foothold in Canada, to get established in Canada. They may be refugee students. There may be all kinds of issues going on in their family backgrounds and personal lives. And so there may not be a lot of opportunity for families to read stories to their children in the home language. They may not be able to find home language books. And what we know from the research on students who are coming from low income backgrounds or low socioeconomic backgrounds is that there tends to be far less access to print in their environments, in the home, sometimes in their neighborhoods, sometimes also in the schools that they attend. And we also know that one of the most powerful predictors of how well students are going to do academically, how well they're going to learn to read, how well their reading comprehension will develop, is the extent to which they get actively engaged with literacy. Another way in which we need to broaden the scope of how we think about EAL students is that a number of these students are also coming from what we could call maybe marginalized backgrounds, or coming from communities that have been marginalized sometimes over many generations in the broader society. There may be prejudices, stereotypes operating in the broader society against particular communities of people who are recent immigrants. And obviously, as Nadia mentioned in her introduction, First Nations and Métis peoples have experienced considerable exclusion from opportunity within the society. And so what does that imply in relation to what the schools do? It means that we need to connect with students' lives and the knowledge, culture, and language of their communities. And if devaluation of identity is a source of opportunity gaps, a source of disengagement on the part of some students, then the school needs to focus on affirming students' identities by enabling them to use their language and literacy skills to carry out powerful intellectual and creative academic work. So that's kind of an overview of like the concrete strategies that I'm going to try and talk about. And so these strategies come from an analysis of, first of all, which groups or categories of students tend to experience underachievement. And the three groups that I mentioned are students who are coming from multilingual backgrounds, who are coming from linguistically diverse backgrounds, whose home language is different from the language of instruction in the school, but also students coming from socially disadvantaged backgrounds and students coming from community backgrounds where the communities have been marginalized or discriminated against, as I said, often over generations. And we need to look at what are the opportunity gaps, or what are the potential causes of underachievement that are associated, that are operating in these groups. And when we've identified them, we can look at, okay, what instructional responses does the research suggest can promote achievement among these students? And where I want to go with this is that it's not enough for individual educators to have a mindset of looking at students' assets, of supporting them in all kinds of ways in the classroom. We need to think in terms of whole school strategies. We need to all be on, or as many possible of us, be on the same page in terms of where we're coming from in relation to our understanding of what are some of the potential causes of underachievement and what we can do as a school community to address those. So go to the next slide. I'm going to show you a framework that I've been working with over the last few years, and that relates to what I've just been saying. And my presentation will follow the outlines of that framework. So these are the three groups that I mentioned that tend to experience underachievement, not in all contexts, but in many contexts, both in North America and in Europe and Australia and elsewhere. And there are different causal factors or opportunity gaps that predict underachievement that operate within each of these settings. Now, there's a lot of overlap between these realities. A lot of immigrant background students are also coming from socially disadvantaged backgrounds. Some are subject to stereotyping in the broader society also. So we need to look at what we can do in relation to all three of these sets of issues. So here's the framework, and I've shared with Nadia, and I assume she has circulated with you a number of handout resources that talk about this framework and the kinds of strategies that I talk about. But I'll just go through this very quickly because I've talked about it to some extent already. So when we look at what kinds of instructional responses are appropriate or are evidence-based in relation to supporting EAL students to succeed academically, as I said, we've got to distinguish between what groups are underachieving. And it's not just students who are learning the language of instruction. Many of those students are also coming from low-income backgrounds, and many of them are coming from communities that have enjoyed or not enjoyed marginalized status in the broader society. And so what you see here is a summary of what I'm going to talk about, where in terms of helping EAL students to succeed academically, the instructional responses involve scaffolding comprehension and production of language across the curriculum. And I'll highlight that across the curriculum, it's not just the job of the EAL teacher, it's everybody's job. There was a book published by a couple of ESL teachers, EAL teachers in the Toronto District School Board back in the early 90s called ESL is Everybody's Business. That was the title of the book. And that message is still as relevant today as it was then. Secondly, we need to look at how we can engage students' multilingual repertoires, because students can use their first language as a stepping stone for stronger performance in English. And I'll share some examples of that with you. And then we also need to reinforce academic language across the curriculum. And I think you'll get a sense of why that is when we talk a little bit about the nature of academic language and what makes it challenging for all students. In terms of students from low SES backgrounds, if limited, there's not a lot that schools can do in terms of things like housing segregation or overcrowding. But we do have a lot of opportunities to address one of the other major factors that operates to limit students' access to literacy and engagement in the school. And that's limited access to print that they may have experienced. And so what that means is that from the day a student walks into school, from the day a student walks into kindergarten, we need to have a mindset of maximizing their access to print, access to stories, and a mindset of getting them actively engaged with literacy, because that's where we find academic language. And that involves not just teaching phonics, that's part of the picture, but it involves working with students to help them develop a sensitivity to how print operates, working with them to dramatize or have fun with some of the storylines in the print. There's all kinds of things that we can do long before students have actually got into decoding and actual reading. And again, reinforcing academic language across the curriculum is key. In terms of students from marginalized status, we need to connect instruction to students' lives. We need to decolonize curriculum and instruction through what some people call culturally sustaining pedagogy. And that clearly is something that has been highlighted in relation to the way we've sanitized the curriculum in relation to the experiences of First Nations communities over, in fact, hundreds of years. That's beginning to change, but the notion of decolonization is one that clearly operates in relation to communities that have been marginalized in the past. And we need to affirm students' identities in association with academic engagement. Basically, what I'm talking about here is enabling students to do powerful things with language, not just after they've so-called learned English, but enabling them to do powerful things with language from a very early stage of their acquisition of English. So this is the framework that everything that I'm going to talk about fits into. So let's look at the first category here, linguistically diverse students. I'm going to talk a little bit about the research background relating to this. Initially, I've mentioned a couple of times the distinction between conversational fluency and academic language proficiency. What we're talking about in terms of conversational fluency is the ability to carry on a conversation in familiar face-to-face situations. In a face-to-face situation, as we know, there's all kinds of ways in which we communicate meaning. We can raise our eyes to heaven, we can gesture, we can communicate meaning with intonation, we can point to things in a concrete context. There's all kinds of ways in addition to just the language itself that meaning gets, through which meaning gets communicated. We're talking about the kind of language that the vast majority of native speakers of any language develop roughly by the time they enter school at age 5. Oops, sorry. But we're talking about only a thin sliver of the language. It's a very important sliver, but it involves use of high-frequency words and simple grammatical constructions, everyday common grammatical constructions. And we know that the language of schooling goes far beyond that. That's why if you think about what we do in schools, we take native speakers of English who've developed native-like fluency in English, and we spend another 12 years expanding the range of things that they can do with language, expanding the genres that they feel comfortable with, expanding their reading skills, their writing skills. So we all intuitively know that there's a big difference between the kinds of conversational skills that all of us, or the vast majority of us, develop in our early years, and then what we need to do in schools with language. And when we look at students who are learning the school language, whether they're born in Canada or have immigrated, typically a ballpark figure is that, within a year or 2 years, a large majority of students have become pretty comfortable in their ability to converse in English and play in the playground and understand what the teacher's likely to say to them. And if they've arrived at a relatively young age, they may sound identical to native speakers of the language. And so one of the implications of this is that teachers may not realize that a student speaks another language at home because they sound just like everybody else. But when we look at what's involved in academic language proficiency and acquiring the language that we need to succeed in school, in the content areas as well as in language arts, what we're talking about is knowledge of the less frequent vocabulary of English, as well as the ability to interpret and produce increasingly complex written language. If you look at, say, a novel that students might be expected to read in grade 8 or grade 9, as opposed to the kind of reading that they're doing in grade 1 or grade 2, you see the obvious differences in the kind of language and the kinds of concepts that are talked about in those different settings. Characteristics of academic language include frequent use of the passive voice, which we very rarely use in everyday conversation, and nominalization, which is the term that linguists use to talk about how we make abstract nouns from a verb or sometimes an adjective. And again, these are rarely used in conversation. And the point that I made before is that because academic language is found primarily in books and other kinds of printed texts, including digital texts, extensive reading is crucial in enabling students to catch up. So let me give you a couple of examples. I took these words from a social studies unit it's actually an American textbook, and this was a unit on the American Revolution. And these are words that most of us probably have not used in the last 2 or 3 years, except maybe within classrooms. But think about how often you've used the term amend. If you've got rambunctious teenagers in your house, you may have used the term amend your ways, young man, or else, or young lady. But induced, preamble, sustain, resolution. These are not the words of friendly conversation. When our patios begin to open up again and we're there with friends, we're not going to be talking about resolutions. We're not going to be talking about inferences. The only preamble we might talk about is a preamble to the next table to chat with people we haven't seen in person for years. And so these are the differences between academic language and the language of everyday conversation are, I think, obvious to all of us. And one of the characteristics of academic language is that there are far more words that come from Latin and Greek roots than there are in conversational language. And to understand how this came about, we've got to go back about 1,000 years or more than that in terms of the history of the English language. Between roughly the 5th century and the 11th century, the language that was spoken in what's now England was an Anglo-Saxon language. It was the language of the Angles and the Saxons. There were tribes that had migrated to what's now England in the 400s and 500s. And in 1066, the linguistic landscape changed because the Normans invaded England from northern France, and naturally they brought their language with them, and that became, as they took over the place, that became the language of high prestige functions within the society. It was obviously already, Latin was the language of the church already, but the Norman language became the language of print, of education for those who were able to get education. And amazingly, that distinction is still with us, because over the next, from about the mid 11th century to the 15th, 16th century, the two languages merged to give us what we now call English. But they didn't merge evenly across all domains and functions of language. The Anglo-Saxon language remained the language of everyday interaction, remained the language of the peasants, the ordinary people. Whereas the Norman-based, Latin-based language was the language of high prestige functions in the society. And literacy was and still is a high prestige function within the society. And so we find this split, this reality that English is a hybrid language. And that has a lot of implications for how we teach and develop students' academic language. When we look at EAL learners, this is a graph that comes from data that I was able to reanalyze from the Toronto board about 40 years ago. So this is going back a long way, but this pattern has been replicated in studies in Israel, in the States, and several other studies in Canada and the UK. But what we see here is a graph charting how long it takes students who are learning the language of instruction to catch up academically. PVT stands for Picture Vocabulary Test. This was one of the tests that was used in the Toronto board in this large-scale survey they did. AOA is the age on arrival, and length of residence is the LOR is length of residence. The scale, the vertical scale is standard deviation units. So -1 there would be the equivalent of 15 standard score points, or if you think in terms of IQ scores, would be the equivalent of 85, where the mean or the average is 100. So what you see here is that after about 1 year of learning English, students are about 22, 23 points on average below grade expectations in terms of their knowledge of English vocabulary. After 3 years, they're about 15 points below. But it's taken roughly between 5 and 7 years for them to get close to grade norms in terms of their knowledge of English. And so this figure of 5 to 7 years, it's a ballpark figure. There'll be a lot of variation depending on students' background, their socioeconomic opportunities, etc. But this pattern has been replicated in many, many studies. In fact, in Israel, research that's been carried out there, large-scale research, showed that at least 11 years is typically required for students to catch up academically. So what does this mean? Well, it means that we may be able to provide EAL support to students in their initial year or 2 years in most contexts. But it means that even after students have learned enough English to participate or seemingly to participate in the mainstream class, there's still going to be big gaps there. And if the mainstream teacher or the content teacher at the secondary level is not aware of this, she may not realize that the students' writing skills or the reading skills that they're showing are part of a process of catching up academically that can take typically at least 5 years. And so that involves the teacher providing the scaffolding and support to enable students to pursue that trajectory of catching up. And the other reason why it takes an apparent long time to catch up academically is that students are catching up to a moving target. Native speakers of English are not just standing still waiting for second language learners to catch up to them. Every year they're increasing their vocabulary, they're increasing their reading skills, increasing their writing skills. And so it's not surprising that it takes that period of time for students to catch up. The good news is that many students do catch up, but some don't. What you see in the slide here is just, again, I'll mention this just briefly. It's a fairly common set of distinctions. This comes from the terminology that Isabel Beck has used. She's somebody who's specialized in vocabulary, and she distinguishes between tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 words. Tier 1 words, these are the bulk of words in English. These are high frequency words used in everyday conversation. Tier 2 words are general academic vocabulary found in academic texts across the curriculum. So these are words that you'll find in different subject areas. You might find it in science, you might find it in math, you might find these words in social studies and language arts. Words like explain, inquire, investigate. Again, most of these words will come from Latin and Greek sources. And then the third tier are low frequency specialized academic vocabulary that typically will be found in particular subject areas. For example, you're not likely to find a word like molecule in a social studies text, or photosynthesis. You're not going to find that in math texts. So this is, I think, a useful way of thinking about how vocabulary is organized in English. And what Isabel Beck and others have highlighted is that in our teaching of vocabulary and our expansion of vocabulary, we need to focus in on tier 2 words because they are high utility academic words. A lot of the tier 1 words students will get from their everyday interaction in English, from watching television, interacting on Facebook or whatever they're using. And tier 3 words they'll get in the context of particular subject matter. But tier 2 words are the high utility words that are crucial to students' academic development. In terms of what we can do, once we understand the nature of academic language, there's a lot that we can do in terms of drawing students' attention to how this language works, building up their awareness of this language, exploring cognate relationships if their home languages are similar in many respects to English, for example, because the academic language of English comes predominantly from Latin and Greek sources. Other languages that are strongly influenced by those sources, like Spanish, like Romanian, like French, will have a lot of cognates. And so if you look at a word like predict, which students will learn when they're learning, come across when they're learning science early in the grade levels. Look at the number of words that root gives students access to. Any Spanish-speaking student will instantly know what contradict means. If we point out that the root here means to say, and pre is the prefix for before, so predicting means that we're saying that something's going to happen before it has actually happened. Contra is a word for against, so contradict is saying, contradicting is saying something against what somebody has said. Gives access to words like dictator. A dictator is somebody who tells you what to do. Dictionary, valedictorian, benediction, all kinds of low incidence words. And so we need to focus in and draw students' attention to how this language operates. So if we look at the strategies that I mentioned, scaffolding language, again, I'm not going to spend any time in this. We all know what scaffolding involves. Scaffolding allows you to operate at a higher level. And so you've got a listing here of some of the scaffolding strategies that are part of the EAL toolkit. Again, to re-emphasize the point, they need to be every teacher's toolkit because students are going to be graduating, if you like, or getting out of EAL support, typically after maybe a year, year and a half, and they're going to be in regular classrooms where a lot of the instruction may be going above their heads. If the teacher is not aware that there are still big gaps, there are likely to be still big gaps in terms of their ability to understand and use the language of academic subject matter. Reinforcing academic language across the curriculum. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just to point out one kind of thing that's useful to internalize into our mindset, and this would apply to French immersion teachers as much as to EAL teachers and mainstream teachers, is that when we're teaching content, it's really important to think about not just teaching the content, but to also build in language objectives into our lesson plans. And if we do that, then we'll be benefiting all students, not just EAL students. And so this is just a kind of a mini template that highlights the fact that we can specify content objectives and language objectives, and then learner activities that might help them pursue those objectives. And the rationale here is that language is infused in all curricular content. And we're missing significant opportunities to accelerate students' progress if we don't reinforce students' grasp of academic language as they're learning subject matter content. And again, at the elementary grades, a lot of teachers will do this automatically because the classroom teacher is teaching the vast majority of subjects. At the secondary level, it's more of a challenge because a lot of teachers see themselves as teachers of their subject matter, and somebody else is going to take care of language issues. I'm a science teacher, I'm a math teacher, this is not my job description. And I think that mindset is not helpful in terms of helping students gain the kinds of language skills, the academic language skills that they need to graduate. So moving on to the strategy of engaging students' multilingual repertoires. This involves teaching for transfer across the curriculum. Nadia mentioned the common underlying proficiency idea that I came up with, and I've depicted this in the context of a dual iceberg or a double iceberg. And the metaphor of language proficiency or language functioning as an iceberg was first suggested by a linguist called Roger Shy back in the 70s. And he made that distinction because he wanted to get across the point that a lot of what is really important about language and how we use language and our knowledge of language is not obvious. It's not visible on the surface. We hear people's accent. We hear how fluent they are. We hear how good they are at telling jokes. All of those things are obvious in our interaction with others. But their ability to write proficiency, their ability to understand complex text is not as obvious on the surface. And so what I did was say, well, okay, if we can take this metaphor, this visual metaphor of language as an iceberg, then we can think of bilingualism, or by extension multilingualism, as a double iceberg, where even though the surface features of the two languages are clearly separate, there's a common underlying proficiency that allows for transfer across languages. So if a student comes into a classroom in Regina or Saskatoon in grade 5 or grade 6, and they've had a solid education up to this point in their home country, and they know the concept of photosynthesis. They've had that as part of their previous science instruction. They don't need to learn the concept of photosynthesis all over again. They've got that concept. What they need to learn is the terminology of that concept for that concept in English, and how to use that language to talk about the concept. But the concept is already there. And so that's basically what we're talking about in this common underlying proficiency. So let me just give you an example of how this transfer process operates from the student's own perspective. This comes from the multiliteracies project that I mentioned earlier on. And the teacher here was an EAL teacher. This was a grade 5 and 6 class that she was teaching at the time. Her name is Lisa Leone. She's an incredibly inspirational teacher. And she consistently encouraged her students to carry out creative writing and other assignments in their home language, and generally use their home language as a stepping stone to English. So here's two experiences or accounts from Amina and Hira about this. They wrote, they were asked to write about, what's the point or what's your reaction in terms of using your first language in the classroom. And so Amina says, when I'm allowed to use my first language in class, it helps me with my writing and reading of English, because if I translation in English to Urdu, then Urdu give me help for English language. I also think better and write more in English when I use Urdu, because I can see in Urdu what I want to say in English. These students were in their first year of learning English. They wrote this, I think, probably in fact in the beginning of the second year of learning English. And then here it says very similar kinds of things. She says, when I'm allowed to use Urdu in class, it helps me because when I write in Urdu and then I look at Urdu words and English comes in my mind. So it helps me a lot. When I write in English, Urdu comes in my mind. When I read in English, I say it in Urdu in my mind. When I read in Urdu, I feel very comfortable because I can understand it. And so what Hira and Amina are basically saying here is what the common underlying proficiency notion is trying to say in a much more abstract way. The term that's used for this, that has come to be used for this, is translanguaging. And we can talk some more about that term later. But it's basically what we're talking about when we talk about translanguaging is bringing the two languages into productive contact and enabling students to use their first language as a cognitive tool to do academic work and to help them acquire academic English. Another example, again from Lisa's class, a different class. This was a dual language book that a student called Tomer wrote. He was in his first year of learning English, and he'd grown up in Israel and had spent a lot of time in an agricultural setting. He loved horses. You can guess what Kentucky refers to in the title of his book. But he wrote this story initially in Hebrew, and there was a teacher in the school who knew enough Hebrew to help him translate that from Hebrew to English. And if you'd given Tomer the English version of a story before he had written it, he would not have been able to read it. But after he had written it, then he could read it. So he learned an enormous amount of language in working collaboratively with the teacher to translate his book from Hebrew into English. And his observations, I think, are really interesting and insightful. He says, I think using your first language is so helpful because when you don't understand something after you've just come here, it's like beginning as a baby. You don't know English and you need to learn it all from the beginning. But if you already have it in another language, then it's easier. You can translate it and you can do it in your language too. And then it's easier to understand the second language. He goes on to say, the first time I couldn't understand what Lisa, his teacher, was saying, except the word Hebrew. But I think it's very smart that you said for us to do it in our language, because we can't just sit in our hands doing nothing. So if you read between the lines here, when he says it's like beginning as a baby, that's an identity statement. Sitting on our hands doing nothing is also an identity statement. I can't participate. I'm coming across as not very bright. And so if you think about this strategy of having students write initially in their first language and use that as a stepping stone to English, or for some students, they can write initially in English and then work with parents or teachers or other students to come up with a first language version of that. What the strategies that are built into this are scaffolding instruction by engaging students' multilingual repertoires. It's connecting to students' lives. It's affirming students' identities. It's reinforcing academic language. It's expanding literacy engagement. So a lot of the strategies that are in that framework that we talked about are ticked off by just this simple strategy. And the same is true of many of the other strategies. Another example of translanguaging, if you like, or bringing the two languages into productive contact comes from a teacher called Robin Persad, an EAL teacher. He was teaching a grade 4 EAL class in an elementary school near Toronto. And he had students from different language backgrounds. He had several students from a number of different language backgrounds in his class. He asked them to compare English with their home languages. So students talked about their home language. They did some research on the internet in terms of characteristics of the language. They asked their parents about characteristics, and they came up with charts like this. You can see English starts from left to right, Arabic starts from right to left. And the number 3 there talks about the kind of sociolinguistic or honorific patterns that you need to observe in speaking Arabic to people like our parents who we need to show a lot of respect to. So again, students are learning a lot about language, learning a lot about English. They're learning a lot about their first language in doing this kind of work. So if we look at students from socially disadvantaged backgrounds, again, the evidence-based instructional response is that we can gain a lot of advantage in terms of boosting students' academic development by immersing students in a print-rich preschool and school environment that promotes sustained literacy engagement. And we also need to reinforce academic language across the curriculum. I've talked about the logic before, so in the interest of time, I'll just move on. One of the people who's done a lot of work on this in the United States is a cognitive psychologist called John Guthrie. And in terms of his understanding of literacy engagement, he's talking about the amount of and range of reading and writing, like that's the obvious part. But he's also talking about how students develop through their reading and through their writing effective strategies for deeper understanding of text. And obviously teachers play a major role in helping students gain access to some of those strategies. And we're also talking about, and these are my terms rather than his, but positive affect and identity investment in reading and writing. Students have got to realize, or they will read much more if they're getting payoff from their reading. If it's something that they enjoy, if they're part of a community, if the teachers in the school or in the classroom have created what Frank Smith, a very famous literacy educator, called joining the literacy club, where students are talking about the books they're reading, they're seeing themselves in the stories, they're writing about things that are of interest to them. And Guthrie noted that in all spheres of life, whether we're talking about driving a car, doing surgery, playing golf, gourmet cooking, whatever, participation is key to the development of proficiency. He says some initial lessons are valuable for driving a car or typing on a keyboard, but expertise spirals upward mainly with engaged participation. And that's key. We have to have a culture of reading and a culture of writing within the entire school. So again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through this in any detail. You'll have access to the PowerPoint afterwards. But basically, there's a lot of research out there showing that literacy engagement can dramatically push back the negative effects of social disadvantage. And remember also, when we're talking about students from marginalized communities, by and large, many of those students are also experiencing social disadvantage. Students who are learning the school language, multilingual language learners, many of them are also experiencing social disadvantage. So this is important for all of the students that we're talking about. But the data that I find most compelling comes from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Many of you may have heard of the PISA studies, the Program for International Student Assessment, that the OECD carries out roughly every 3 years in more than 70 countries around the world. And one of the things that they've found consistently is that reading engagement among 15-year-olds, because that's the age that they look at, is a stronger predictor of reading achievement than students' socioeconomic status. And so they point out that there's about a 1/3 overlap between the negative effects of low socioeconomic status and the positive effects of literacy engagement. In other words, schools could potentially push back about 1/3 of the negative impact of social disadvantage if they could get low socioeconomic status students actively engaged with literacy from an early age. This is huge. Every teacher, every school principal should be actively aware of this because it's key. And it's a mindset issue. It's a socialization issue as much as just a teaching and learning issue. If students begin to enjoy books, if they have positive experiences with books, if they can talk about books, they're going to want to read. And a lot of students, a lot of our own kids, those of us in this audience, a lot of us have exposed our children to books, have read stories to them from the time that they're, crawling around eating dirt from the floor. A lot of kids who are coming from poverty backgrounds and less socially advantaged backgrounds have not had that opportunity. And so that means that in schools, we need to really focus on bridging that gap. Okay, this is talking about long-term effects of what the authors call print saturation at the preschool level. This was a longitudinal study that went over more than 10 years in New Zealand. And basically, students who were in preschool environments, early childhood education environments that focused a lot on books, had a lot of books there, did far better at age 10, 14, and 16 in terms of reading achievement than students who had a less print saturated experience. So what does this mean in terms of what we do within our schools? Let me just give you a couple of examples. This is from a school called Crescent Town School, an elementary school, actually fairly close to where I live in Toronto. About 90% of the students come from non-English speaking backgrounds. The school gets some extra money because it's seen as an inner city school. And one of the ways they spent this money was to keep the school library open 4 days a week between 4 o'clock in the afternoon and 7 o'clock, so that between Monday and Thursday, when parents came in to pick up their kids, they could go right into the school library and sit with their children and read books with them. And they had a multilingual collection that parents could read also. They could check out books with their children to bring home to read at home. This is exactly what the research is saying we should be doing in terms of maximizing students' opportunity to gain access to print and see print as being part of their lives. In the same school, I wandered around it one day. Outside one of the classroom, there were these little posters that students had made, and with the sentence starter saying, "Reading makes me powerful because," and students had written different ways in which they thought reading made them powerful. And this obviously came from discussions that the teacher was having with students in the class about what's the point of reading? Why do we read? And so this student says, "Reading makes me powerful because I get smarter and I learn more facts. I learn new words and I will never forget." I'm not sure about the last point about never forgetting, but all of the rest is totally supported by the research. Another example, it comes from Tasneem, who says, "Reading makes me powerful because when I grow up, I can find a better job than people who can't read." Somebody can also trick you to do something that will get you into trouble. In other words, if you don't have high literacy skills, you're probably not going to read the small print in any agreement that you're signing. And you can get yourself into serious trouble as a result of that. You can be exploited. Tasneem goes on to say, "Reading gives you new words to learn. It gives my brain new ideas. It helps your vocabulary so that when you need to write something, you can use longer and harder words. In school, you can get a better mark using more words." I'm sure that Tasneem is probably the CEO of some big multinational corporation because she had everything worked out at age 11. And this is everything she says is supported by research. And what the teacher has, I think, very skillfully done here is build up that link between reading and identity. And that's key to enabling students or encouraging students to continue reading. If a student thinks that reading makes her powerful, she's going to want to read. Here, like some ideas for whole school approaches to literacy policy. I'm not going to go through them because we're running out of time, but you can look at these later. These are the kinds of things that as a school community, we can talk about. We can look at where we are right now in terms of our focus on literacy engagement and how important it is. We can see some gaps maybe in our provision, and we can think about ways in which we can move in a direction that might be more effective with the students we're teaching. So moving to the third category, as I said, like the devaluation of identity is a cause of underachievement. And I think nobody said it better or more clearly than Gloria Ladson-Billings, who's a very eminent African-American educator who works out of Wisconsin. And she was talking about African-American students. And she said the problem that African-American students face is the constant devaluation of their culture, both in school and in the larger society. So what can we do about that? There's some very simple things that we can do. Here's a sign in at the entrance of a school in the Toronto area, where the school board will give any school that requests it signs for the office in up to 10 different languages. And so this is very simple. It costs minimal amount of additional funds, but think about the impact it has on students when they see their language on the one of the first things that they see when they come into the school. Think about the impact of parents on parents. So very simple things can kind of challenge the marginalization processes that are operating in, unfortunately, a lot of contexts. An example from a grade 5 teacher in a school that has been at the forefront of many of these initiatives, Thornwood Public School in the Peel board near Toronto. Tobin Zikmanis was teaching a grade 5 unit. It was on data management. And his school had about 80% of the students coming from non-English speaking backgrounds. And he thought, well, why should I use the textbook? There's other more creative ways of teaching students about data management. So we had the students brainstorm about the languages that were spoken in their school. Who are we as a school community linguistically? Again, that's an identity question. And what would we like to know about that? And so the students came up with 3 fairly simple questions. Then Tobin divided the students into small groups of 3 and 4, and each group took a different grade level. And with the help of the teachers of the different classes, they administered their mini questionnaire. They came back and they poured their data into a spreadsheet program, and they came up with all kinds of ways of representing the data. And this communicated to students that math was a powerful tool in enabling us to see reality. These students were discovering things that had not been known before in terms of the different languages that were spoken in the school. This is just one of the the pie chart that they came up with, or that their program generated for them. And Tobin talks about the fact that he couldn't get his students to go out for recess because they were so engaged with churning out new graphs or talking about different aspects of the data. And this kind of project could have been continued in various ways. It happened in May, so there wasn't a lot of opportunity to really pursue it, but students could go home and interview parents about the languages that they speak and do similar kinds of calculations. They could write up their results in a school newsletter or on a school webpage that parents can see. So this kind of project lends itself to cross-curricular opportunities for promoting students' understanding of content and language. This is a project, and I'll end with this. This is a project that was started by a researcher at Wilfrid Laurier University in the Waterloo area. Christina Montero, and she's a teacher educator, and she wanted her students to, or teacher candidates, to get a better sense of what life was like and what the culture of First Nations communities was. And so she worked with community organizations and with a high school in the Hamilton area that had a special school within a school that was a First Nations focused school. And they brought in an Ojibwe speaking Cree artist from the community. And he worked with the students in terms of creating art, writing poetry or prose in reaction to the art that they themselves or others had created. And it was an incredibly powerful process. The students' work has been displayed in 3 different art galleries across Ontario. And I'll just give you a sampling from one student, from Cassandra Baisog, in terms of what this experience meant for her. She says, "This experience gave me a gift of poetry. I started to develop a passion for poetry during this project. I didn't know I had this passion. Since this project, I've written and shared many pieces of poetry. Participating in this project was like hearing a collective voice telling me, we're proud of you, we care about you, you have a future. Being able to express my thoughts about who I am as an Ojibwe woman made me feel like I belonged and I was connected to a larger community." She goes on to say, take away identity, and what do you have? If you have a student that doesn't know who they are, do you think they care about what goes on in the classroom? Again, I think that's a powerful insight to think about. And so when we're talking about students from communities that have been marginalized and are still marginalized in many respects across Canada, we need to focus on connecting instruction to their lives. We need to focus on valuing their culture, valuing their language or languages, if those languages are still being spoken in the communities, and basically affirming their identities and enabling them to do powerful things with language or with other communication media, such as art. So let me stop there, and I'll open it up for questions. Actually, before doing that, let me just, there's one other slide. If we're talking about a whole school approach and thinking about how we can operate as a school community to promote students' achievement from those 3 overlapping categories of student, one useful question to start with is, what is the image of the child that we're sketching in our instruction? What's the image of the student that we're sketching in our instruction? So if we were to take a bird's eye view of all of the interactions going on in our school, what would we see? Would we see an image of the student as somebody who's capable of becoming bilingual and biliterate, capable of higher order thinking and intellectual accomplishments? And if we think about that, as I said, in a number of cases, the mindset has been that, well, students can't really do any kind of higher order thinking or inquiry projects that are challenging intellectually because they don't speak English. They don't have enough English to do these things. I've shown you some examples of the kinds of things that students can do. And so if students get the message that they're not capable of engaging in higher order thinking and intellectual accomplishments until a year and a half or 2 years into their learning of English, that's a message about their identity that may get internalized in a negative way. Is the image of the student one who's capable of creative and imaginative thinking, capable of creating literature and art, generating new knowledge, capable of thinking about and finding solutions to social issues? So I think this is a useful starting point for thinking about the kinds of instructional strategies that we may want to pursue in more detail. So I'll really stop here at this point and open it up for questions or issues that you want to raise.
Okay, and before we start the questions, I'd like to thank Dr. Cummins very much for joining us today. As some of you know, I'm Shannon Story, the academic coordinator of the Sir TESOL program, as Nadia is the academic coordinator of the PD SEAL. And in our courses, we use a lot of the materials you produce and a lot of the ideas that you've promoted. So our students are very much your beneficiaries, and those students include many of the people who are with us today. And I should also mention in SK TEAL, we've been working on a project for the last few months on creating science curriculum that integrates and scaffolds English, and working with the Science Teachers Association to do that. And this talk makes me even more enthusiastic about extending that work to other subject areas, because we really are all English language teachers. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Shannon.
Thank you so much, Shannon, for expressing our collective thanks to Dr. Cummins for this very interesting, insightful, and valuable presentation today. We have a couple of questions that have come in. The first one is from Gail, and she says, could you please comment on the implications on adult ELLs who are newcomers to Canada? And I'm not quite sure in what sense, if that's language barriers, economic barriers, but you know, can you comment on the implications for adult ELLs?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's obviously a really important one, because adults are in a very different situation from students in the school for obvious reasons. They're trying to survive in Canada as newcomers, often with minimal income. They're trying to establish themselves economically as well as in the job market. And so the challenges are really strong, whether we're talking about people who may have come as refugees or asylum seekers who may be missing education or may have gaps in their education, or whether they're coming as more, I guess, higher end economic immigrants who need to gain the kind of English that will allow them to become credentialed in Canada within their professions. So there's a wide degree of diversity within the adult EAL community or population, and that obviously has to be taken into account in terms of what strategies make sense. But my sense is that most of the things that I've talked about here are directly relevant also to adult learners. But clearly the context is different. When we're talking about EAL students in K-12, we're talking about students who are in school for 5 hours a day, 6 hours a day, depending on the context. And so they have time to learn and time to catch up. Adult learners often don't. And they're trying to learn English at the same time as they're trying to do a lot of other things, take care of family, gain income and stuff like that. But when we look at some of the things that I think are directly relevant, one is connecting instruction, connecting curriculum to students' lives. We all know that if we're talking about things that we're familiar with, we're much more engaged, we're much more fluent than if we're talking about things that have very little resonance with our lives. So that means that we've got to find content that will be specific or relevant to the particular communities that we're teaching and their particular background and experiences. So there's no such thing as one size fits all. Secondly, we need to acknowledge the fact that they're coming in not as blank slates, they're coming in with a wide range of experiences, some experiences that obviously none of us would ever want to experience. There may be a lot of trauma in some cases. Again, that has to be addressed sensitively in terms of connecting to students' lives. We need to know what students are, or what adult learners are willing to talk about, how much trust there may be that needs to be generated before they can get into some issues that are key to their experiences. But I think generally, the more we can connect with students' lives, the more we can talk about things that allow them to connect what they know to what they want to know and need to know to integrate into Canadian society, the better. So having students look at newspapers that are in their community in terms of what's going on in their community, using that as reading material is something that's directly relevant to them. If there are community newspapers in the languages that they speak, that can be an important connection also in terms of them going from one language to another. The reality here is, I'm sure anybody involved with in teaching adult EAL learners know, is that there are many challenges for students, there are many challenges for teachers, and we need to connect with students, we need to value students, and we need to go beyond thinking of English as just a set of structures, of vocabulary or literacy skills that students need to know. They will learn English once they're engaged in issues and talking about issues that are of direct concern to their lives.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Cummins, for that answer. And we have 3 other questions that have come through, and hopefully we can get to all 3 before we conclude. The next question is from Lisa, and she asks, how do we as ESL, EAL professionals communicate all this to regular classroom teachers and principals for the benefit of students who don't have supportive instructors?
Yeah, that's the elephant in the room. Let me just talk about my own experience in trying to do exactly that within the context of the university. Right now in OISE, the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, where I spent about 35 years of my life, there is a mandatory course on teaching ESL or EAL, teaching English language learners across the curriculum. But for about 25 years or more, colleagues of mine and I begged our colleagues in the department to make a course like this mandatory for all teacher candidates. And the answer we got was that there's no time. We've only got 1 year to prepare teachers. This is secondary. People who want to do this can do an additional qualification course. And so it was seen as not something that principals needed to know anything about. It was not something that teachers, other than ESL teachers, needed to know anything about. And it's incredibly frustrating. And what led to a change was when the teacher education program was expanded by the Ministry of Education to 2 years. And then we could get that in there. But the reality is that a lot of our colleagues who are obviously committed teachers, a lot of the administrators, principals, and vice principals in our schools have not had the opportunity to gain access to the kinds of things that I've talked about today. There's nothing very complicated about what I've talked about. It's a lot of it is common sense. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to get our heads around the basic principles. And we learn by participating. But the mindset is still very common. And from your question, I'm guessing it's common also in Saskatchewan, that helping newcomer students or multilingual language learners to acquire English is the job of the EAL teacher. And I'm not sure how we communicate that except by persistence, except by people like Nadia and her colleagues in the universities highlighting this, not just for new teachers, but for also principals. You know, it really doesn't make any sense for people to be advanced or to leadership positions within school systems when they don't have basic knowledge about some of the issues relating to EAL students. And so, you know, there's a lot of kind of no-cost directions that we could pursue in making this happen. But it needs leadership from ministries of education, it needs leadership from universities, and it needs leadership from principals organizations and teacher unions to say, like, there's some basic things that we need to know, and we need to have a whole school strategy if our students are going to succeed. And all of us, as educators, as citizens, have a strong vested interest in helping all students to succeed. And as I said, it's a mindset issue rather than a, you know, internalizing a set of complex strategies. It's the simple strategy of trying to connect our instruction to students' lives automatically means that we have to pay attention to the languages that they know. We have to help them use those languages as stepping stones to English. And that applies whether we're teaching science, whether we're teaching math, or other areas. So I don't have any formulaic answer to the question, except that it is a central question if we want to improve education in any province or in any district.
Thank you very much for that answer. And yes, it is still somewhat prevalent that EAL teachers are tasked with all of the heavy lifting with EAL learners. And, you know, classroom teachers just want to teach. They want to teach subject area content. And, you know, this is quite a shift in their thinking. And we have another. Yes,
if
go ahead.
I could just jump in again there, just a quick comment. Classroom teachers just want to teach, but they also want to teach effectively. That's why they're in the classroom. And so the way that I think we can help open up conversation about these issues is if we can communicate that they're going to be more successful. Their identities as educators are going to be much more affirmed by adopting a few simple strategies and working collaboratively with the language specialists within the school. Everybody's going to feel better about what they're doing.
And that's a really positive way to frame the message. Thank you for giving us that. And it leads into the next question. And you mentioned languages and translanguaging. And there's a message, or question from Heather as follows: How do we, or should we avoid Google Translate? It is very popular for students who want to show their academic thinking.
Okay, great question. Google Translate is something that a lot of people like to disparage. And if one is just using it as a translation, let's say from Spanish, students' home language, to English, you're going to get a garbled translation coming back. But that garbled translation can be a pedagogical and instructional godsend. It's and think about what we could do. We've got a newcomer student who's come in from Mexico, let's say, and in grade 4. We want to know what the student can do in terms of literacy, how much literacy she or he has. So we may ask students to write when other students may be writing in English, have that student write on the same topic in her first language. And then ideally, the student would write in an electronic form, or we can put it into an electronic form and press a couple of buttons, and Google Translate will spit out an English version of it, a somewhat garbled English version. But that English version is going to be enough for the teacher to understand what students are trying to say. It's also going to be enough for a little editorial team of 2 or 3 other students to work with the newcomer students to come up with an English version of what she's written, and to talk about the connections between Spanish and English. If there are other Spanish speakers in the class who are more fluent in English, they could be part of that. But you do a lot of things at the same time here. You help students create a dual language book that she or he can be proud of, that they can show their parents. It's in Spanish as well as in English. She's talking about her experiences, or talking about creative writing that a story that she's created that can be shared with the other students. She's shown that she's literate in her first language and that she can use that language. She's made friends, connection with a group of students who are helping her, working with her. She's probably teaching them some Spanish as they're learning, or as she's learning English. So Google Translate, I think, can be a really powerful tool when used appropriately within the classroom. And even with parent interviews, where parents may not be really fluent in English, Google Classroom can give the gist of what we're trying to talk about with students. So I think there's a lot of ways in which it can be used very productively.
Thank you very much for that response. And as long as we're cautious with some of those translations, and we know that they're not always accurate, as you say, I think it's a very good tool to look inside the minds of some of our students in their first languages. We have another question from, and it's given by Yvonne. At what point in language development do you think that over-reliance on translation from L1 to English, it becomes a hindrance?
I'm not sure that it's an issue that is going to come up a lot, because the students who are in our classrooms, the vast majority of them want to get into the mainstream. They want to belong. They want to learn English as quickly as possible. And what we've discovered, and what people who've used this program have discovered with an online resource called Binogi, B-I-N-O-G-I. If you go to binogi.com or binogi.ca, you'll see what it does. But this, colleagues of mine and I have been doing some research with this over the last couple of years. It was developed in Sweden and has now moved to Canada. But it provides curriculum content in science and math and some other areas in English, as well as in multiple other languages. So students, say a student from an Arabic speaking background, can look at a 5 to 6 minute animated video on something like photosynthesis. And she can listen to that. If she's a newcomer student who's just learning English, she can listen to it in Arabic and read the subtitles in Arabic, and or she can listen to it in English. And what the people who've developed this have noticed, and what we've noticed in using it, is that students in their first year of learning the language, they will gradually transition from using the home language, reading in the home language, listening in the home language, to maybe listening after about 6 months or so, listening in the first language, but reading in English, or vice versa. And so over that first year, you see a transition where they're using the first language as a support, they're getting the content, and then they're checking out how this sounds and how this looks in English. So I think an over-reliance on translation is not something that is going to be a major problem for most students. And when we're translating, ideally we're doing it for a particular purpose, like writing a dual language book, or in a science class. What a number of teachers have done is have students divide up into groups. Each one takes a different system of the body, the respiratory system, the digestive system, and then they prepare a lesson for a younger class, maybe a grade 6 class prepares a lesson for a grade 2 class on the human body. And they label the different parts of the system, both in English and in one or more additional languages. When they're doing that, that's translation for a purpose. And I think that's incredibly powerful in highlighting the fact that we are multilingual students. These languages are useful in communicating with other students who may speak these languages, and it's a way of showcasing our knowledge. So there's all kinds of ways in which translation is not the enemy, as it's often been depicted in the language learning, language teaching community. It can be a very powerful way of bringing the two languages into contact, but in the context of students actually doing powerful things with the language.
Thank you very much for that response. And as someone who's had to translate and interpret from one language to another, I can tell you that it really is difficult. It calls on all of your faculties all at once to try to provide that translation. So I think it's a great skill for kids to have and to keep.
Exactly.
And one other, this will be the final question. And there's a comment and then a question at the end from Holly. I've worked with many EAL learners who have not learned to read in L1 in their first language. In addition to supporting students with print-rich environments, would you also recommend oral-rich environments in their first language? Holly says, I've been using video in students' first languages so that they can access their languages if they cannot read it. Instead of reading their language, they listen to it and speak prior to activities. Is this as valuable as providing print-rich environments in your view?
Absolutely. You know, students come into our classrooms with all kinds of experiences. Some languages are not, don't have a rich print environment, or they're oral languages. In other cases, the students may not have had the opportunity to learn to read that language. For example, students born in Canada often come to school without knowledge of reading skills in their home languages. Parents may not have seen that as a priority, or for whatever reason. But the oral language is doing very much the same kind of thing when we move beyond just simple conversational interactions like pass the salt, or the kind of dinner table interactions. When parents or teachers, for that matter, are telling stories in the home language, when students are watching videos in the home language, they're expanding their knowledge of the language from beyond the here and now, and they're getting into rich concepts in the language, and they also can translate into English. So obviously, it's great if children are literate in their home language, and in interacting with parents, we should certainly encourage them to try and develop their children's literacy in their home language if that's something that is feasible for them to do. But if that's not part of what's possible or feasible in those situations, certainly encouraging them to spend a lot of time with their kids. Grandparents can be terrific in this, in terms of grandparents telling stories, grandparents expanding students' knowledge of their own culture. And so all that oral language environment is incredibly powerful, and it's something that can translate or lead into literacy as students expand their knowledge of the home language. So, but a lot depends on the situation of parents, the educational level of parents in their home language, and a lot of other things.
Great, thank you very much. We have, I'm sure there are other questions among our participants, but we have reached the time limit. And what we'll try to do is write down what you've said, Dr. Cummins, in response to these questions. And we're going to send those responses out to the participants, just so that they have something in print after this presentation is done. So with that, I'd just like to thank you once again for participating in today's session. We have a number of individuals to thank, actually. Once again, I'd like to thank the Saskatchewan Teachers of English as an Additional Language, or Sask-TEAL, for collaborating with the College of Education on this initiative. And of course, we'd like to thank you, Dr. Cummins, for sharing the handouts with us, for spending this time with us, for answering our questions, and for your willingness to share your expertise with us in this very short, I know, intense time period. It's hard to summarize some of these big pieces of information in compressed amount of time, but you've done it beautifully, and you've just reinforced so many of the things that we know are just good best practices with EAL learners. And once again, I'd just like to thank our administrative support team, the Department of Curriculum Studies, and the Dean's Office for promotion and for technical support. And then one other thing that I'd like to mention once again is that you have a book coming out in August, and I'm looking forward to seeing this publication, and I think many of the people in the room are as well. So thank you very much for sharing your wisdom with us in this August 2021 release, which is available through Multilingual Matters. And then finally, if people are interested in gaining certification in EAL education, you know where to find us at the College of Education, and we do use a lot of the materials that you've provided, Dr. Cummins, over the years. Your material has been foundational to many of our courses. So thank you so much for the body of work that you've given to all of us. And thank you for your continued work in this area. So with that, I'd like to close today's webinar and have a good evening, everyone. Enjoy the weather because as everyone says in Saskatchewan, wait 5 minutes and things will change. So thank you very much and good evening.
Thanks, Nadia. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.